Guys, from Yonkers Voice, here we are again, and today we have a very important interview. Because this bill, A8711, it's an important bill.
Very important.
Okay. So most of you know about autism. We have seen a lot of things across the nation where police is not prepared or they don't know about the situation with the person that they're going to be facing.
Correct.
So this bill actually helps.
It really does, Ruin. I really appreciate the opportunity. This bill is Assembly Bill 8711, and this bill is designed to allow the Department of Transportation and the Motor Vehicles Department on the driver license of people, adults with autism, to have a distinctive mark on the license that allows law enforcement officials and emergency technicians, EMS and ambulance and other related staff, to recognize that when they communicate with a driver with autism, they realize and they're trained to deal with this driver, because individuals with autism, whether children or adults, are known to have impediments, issues involving communications, issues involving the ability to take commands or take directives, and very often for the person who's dealing with a person with autism not to be aware, may take it the wrong way. They may take that reaction or the lack of reaction as a form of disobedience.
Correct.
Or as a form of insult or disrespect. Sure. And very often it can lead to harsh circumstances.
Now, Mr. Nader, this identifier that this bill proposes to be on a driver's license, will an identifier also be placed on the windshield? Because by the time I ask for the driver's license, a lot of things could have happened already. They see the police officer, they react in a way that the police officer might take, or EMS,
Sure.
that might take it as a hostile.
Yeah.
So a lot of things can happen. Will it be also a symbol, a sticker that will be placed on the windshield that gives the identification of the
Sure.
person right before?
Ruud, this is a good point, and whenever bills are proposed, very often when it goes to the Transportation Committee in this case, as in any other bill, there's discussions, and very often there's usually more input from either members of the Assembly, and if there's a sponsor in the Senate, which I assume would be, discussions take place, and very often issues like this, do we go a few steps further? Do we try to refine it? And the answer is yes. I believe that some sort of an indication on a windshield, but then the issue becomes, if you're driving, we're assuming that you're a driver and it's your car. What if you drive another car? The problem is, or what if the plates are different and you're driving somebody else's car? It could be helpful, if the person that owns the vehicle doesn't mind that they have a driver in the family or someone that they authorize to drive that has autism, then of course it would be a good follow-up or a good additional mark. Because you're right, when they do approach the car, very often open the window.
That's my trigger.
Yeah, give me your driver's license. And if the person, not intentional, has autism and just ignores the law enforcement official, then we have some law enforcement officials' egos go up and they say, oh, this guy is ignoring me, or this person is ignoring me, and they get upset. So the intent of the bill, and we can go a few steps further and make sure in the state of Texas where the bill is, it's on a computerized system statewide where the plates of the person, but in New York, it's really up to the Transportation Committee to see. The motive of the bill is to recognize people with autism need to have law enforcement or other staff familiar with their situation so they can deal with it.
I agree, but from my point of view, like if you're handicapped, you have a sticker saying you're handicapped, okay? And handicap creates no hostile situation.
No.
Autism might,
It might.
It
Yes.
might be, and we have seen things on the news
Sure.
where police comes to a situation, the person is an EDP person, reacts in a way. Officers don't know.
Don't know.
Okay, they don't know, so they might react in a hostile
negative
way, in a negative
yes.
way.
Sure.
Okay, so I think that if there is such a law, before the police officer actually reaches the person and the person gives the driver's license,
They're already familiar with the
Yes.
circumstance.
they should already be
Sure.
familiar with the circumstances and know how to handle that
Yeah.
person. Now, Mr. Nader, how this came about? You know,
This came about. There was an individual who wrote to social media, a fellow by the name of Peter Gagliardi, from Upper Westchester, I believe, and basically was concerned because he had an adult son who had autism, and he was seriously concerned and put out the message to potentially state assembly or senatorial people, to explore looking at the option. I'm from the school of thought where, you keep your ears and eyes open, and I communicate, well, even my days as a school principal, some of the best recommendations to change a school or change policy or change procedures came from children in discussions or from parents or staff members. And this is similar. As state legislators, we keep our eyes and ears open, and when we hear of potential situations where someone has a concern, someone has a recommendation, as this individual put out, my staff and my office took the initiative to say, hey, this looks good and this looks realistic and
That's
rational, and we took it on. So I placed the bill in the process, which goes to the Transportation Committee. As you're aware, anytime there's a change of policy in New York, it goes to the so-called People House, which is the New York State Assembly. That's where legislation and policy generally is initiated. When it's sponsored and researched and put on the floor and voted upon, the next step, it goes to the Senate. It goes to the Senate, there's a sponsor in the Senate. If it's approved in the Senate, then it goes to the governor's office. That's the layers in New York State.
now. Where is this particular bill?
Now it was just sponsored about a month ago, or a little less, and the bill now will appear when we go back into session in January. Will go before the Transportation Committee. I anticipate a bill like this shouldn't have opposition, because it's really a win-win. And for an individual that for whatever reason feels, well, I don't want to mark on my license because it may violate my individual rights, there's a clause in there that allows for an opt-out. So a person has an option to say, hey, I'd love, for example, to have people know I have autism, and then at least that alleviates potential, in my opinion, dangerous situations. And if for whatever reason a person wants to opt out, it's their right to opt out. So, it's a benefit. It's something that most people that deal, like in law enforcement, the people that we've spoken to, are very much in favor of this.
Now, that was going to be my next question. Something like this, if it's approved, there is other implications. That is training of law enforcement, because now they need to be trained on how to deal with these people. Supposedly, they're already trained, correct?
The understanding is they do have the training.
They do.
They do have the training, but sometimes even if you're trained, if you're not familiar the person has autism, that time frame it takes till you're aware the person has autism may already escalate a situation where it becomes dangerous, or there's a lack of communication. So even though the training is there, I even believe this would give law enforcement and emergency staff even more of a reason to become more familiar. So it has other benefits, where we know law enforcement has professional development like any other field. EMS staff have professional development. And this is another area where we build on, even if there is training, the goal is to encourage law enforcement and EMS staff to train themselves a little bit more, become more familiar, and I think it really takes away potential dangerous situations.
Now, have you found anyone on your research, or perhaps with law enforcement that objects this. You are saying, and I agree, that we should have no objections.
It should be.
And this is optional. You want that mark
Sure.
there if you choose to have that mark there.
Exactly.
But there is always two ways of looking at everything.
Of course.
Have you found any objections so far?
The only objection I found, like I said, I see widespread support from people that are involved with law enforcement and EMS that feel it's a worthy piece of legislation. The only concern was the privacy aspects. And this is why the opt-out clause, in my opinion, gets rid of that concern. Because if you have an issue and you really believe it might impact my privacy, and I don't want anyone to see a mark on my driver's license because it may impact employment opportunities. I don't want my job or potential employers to say, well, this person has autism, why should I hire him or her?
Exactly.
So there is those concerns, and that's why you have the opt-out. But also for employment, my belief is you already have the American Act, Disability Act, that really protects individuals with disabilities, and autism is a disability, from being discriminated upon because of their disability.
But Mr. Nader, sorry to interrupt you, but if we go on that route, there is so many laws
Of course.
that's supposed to protect you. At the end of the day,
They don't.
they don't. And currently we've
Yeah.
seen one that is going on.
Sure.
I don't want to bring that into the conversation,
Yeah.
but probably you know what I'm talking about.
Sure, definitely.
You know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. But what about other legislations that you've been working? You were elected how long ago, Mr. Nader?
A year.
A year ago.
A year ago.
And soon, huh?
I have a lot of pieces. I have like at least 15 bills I've sponsored already, that I personally sponsored in many different areas, dealing with people with disabilities, making sure that the transportation department, and we see it now at very important intersections by courthouses or others, where you hear a new device now that makes sounds and has the ability to inform a visually or hearing impaired disabled person of the traffic conditions. So we're looking for the state to do a statewide research on major intersections, because I can understand if a person can't hear or can't see, how do you know when you cross a street, especially at an important intersection, unless you have somebody with you, or it's very difficult. So bills like this, bills like the foundation aid, we spoke a few times before about the inequity that Yonkers public schools, and not just Yonkers, I have a bill sponsored already. It's in the works, that calls for the state education department to make the way we fund public education more equitable. Why is that important? Because when you look at a school district like Yonkers and many other districts across the state that happen to be in rich counties or wealthy counties, they get a lot less money than their counterparts in similar cities, similar concerns, similar needs. For example, Yonkers for years was getting about $5,000 a year less per child every year because we're part of Westchester County. Less than Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, same percentage of English language learners, special ed children. And the biggest thing is children that are on free and reduced lunch. That's a federal formula that's been around for many, many years. It works. That determines the wealth of a family, right? And it's the best determining factor. Meanwhile, we're considered part of Westchester County. We know we're a rich county, but in the case of Yonkers, 80% of our kids are on free and reduced lunch. So what is the correlation between we're part of Westchester County, and it's not we're getting 500 less per kid or 1,000 where it's not a big deal. $5,000 a year less per kid.
It's a big deal.
And then they say, why is it Yonkers is up in Albany, our PTA, our administration, our community is year after year lobbying for more funding because we got a structural problem. It's not because of misappropriation of funds. Yonkers, for the lack of funding and the lack of resources, and you look at the progress our school system has come up with, an 87% graduation rate, the highest in the state among urban school districts, right? Above the state average. Above the state average, our urban school district has accomplished. And why? Because in Yonkers, we put a lot of emphasis on alternative programs, on STEM and the sciences, on trying to restore support services, on making sure initiatives like My Brother's Keeper and the JCY mentorship programs and after school targeted, that all plays a positive role. I can say that as an educator for 40 years.
Well, let me just interrupt. You know, for those that didn't follow Mr. Nader's career, I know him for many, many years, but 20 some years, when he was a principal of PS 13. He's an educator. If there is someone who understands the formula, this magic formula that most of us don't understand, if there is someone who understands it, it's you. Okay.
Thank you.
And perhaps you could take a couple seconds. Well, you did.
Explain the formula.
But in a simplistic way.
Sure.
Okay. So when people talk about this formula, we know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes, Westchester County is a rich county.
Correct.
Yonkers is not.
No, Yonkers
Okay, we might have a handful certain areas, but the majority of the bulk of the people is not. And like you said, the majority of the kids here are on reduced lunch. So let's take a couple seconds, just to, if you don't mind.
Yeah. The proposal in the past, people say, well, Yonkers tried to change it in the past. I think personally that whatever change you put forth, especially being that it's statewide, needs to have implications statewide. To go and lobby politically to change something just for Yonkers is difficult. So this new initiative puts forth a need to change and review the entire formula statewide, because not only Yonkers, you have a lot of communities, in my opinion, that are similar to Yonkers that will gain from this legislation, like Port Chester and Ossining and East Ramapo. These are communities that, in my opinion, and across the state, that may also benefit. The formula, in my opinion, should include 5 variables, as they say, 5 components. One being the number of special ed kids you have in your school district. One being enrollment, because some school districts are increasing enrollment, like Yonkers, and many across the state are losing enrollment. You look at the English language learners population, right? Why are special ed and English language learners important? Because we know as educators, to properly prepare and help a child with special ed needs or an English language learner, you need more resources. You can't put more than 12 to 15 kids with high needs population in a classroom, whereas you can put 28, 30 kids in a classroom, a normal regular classroom. So right away, you need double the space. You need more teacher aides, you need more staff members, you need more support services to make sure these kids have the skills to compete and learn, right? Then you look at what I'm including in the formula is the percentage of free and reduced lunch. I strongly believe that's the best indicator of the wealth of the students you serve. So if you include that component, and then you can still tie in the wealth of the community you live in. But right now the state formula, the present formula, puts a lot of emphasis on that wealth of the county. That is really detrimental for communities like Yonkers and others. So if you look at those 5 variables and you begin to redesign the state funding formula, then in my opinion, you allow less inequities. You start building an equal platform where people across the state, school districts, have equity in funding based on their student population and their needs. And that's where this formula, it's already a bill that's presented, It's before the Education Committee. My hope is that we're able to push it at a committee this coming session and rally support for it across the state. Already, Senator Shelley Mayer, who's the chairperson of the state Senate Education Committee, is already holding roundtable discussions across the state, basically on the same topic.
Now, Mr. Nader, you just articulated the 5 components needed.
Correct.
Now, I'm sure that there is someone that might be disagreeing with you, because this is nothing new. I've been in Yonkers for many years, and I've been hearing the same argument over and over and over in the formula. Somebody must have articulated what you just did.
Correct.
To Albany.
Yeah.
What's
the difference?
Yeah.
I'll tell you what the difference is. Twofold. As we said earlier, one major difference, the proposed change is statewide. It's not a Yonkers fix.
So before they were looking for the Yonkers fix?
Yonkers fix. And the other part, which I think is very important, looking at it from the political end, this bill has what they call a hold harmless clause, which means that when we fix the inequity and try to bring people that are below where they should be up to par, right? It has a hold harmless where if your school district is at a certain level, you can't lose. So you're guaranteed, if you're in Long Island and you're other parts of the state where you've enjoyed a higher than average percentage of funding, you don't want to give Yonkers more when it's going to be taken out of your pocket and your school district would suffer. Mm-hmm. So this bill allows every community to stay at the very least where it's at, where you can't lose, and that the additional resources that the border regions in the state have been pushing, we would restore those that are inequitable to a fair playing field. And those that are already at the fair playing field would be guaranteed that you won't lose below where you're at. So politically, you're more inclined now, if you're representing those communities, to say, you know, I can support this fix-all new legislation because at least my community won't get hurt. So I think that's the different dynamics of statewide initiative, a funding formula that's practical, that's based on legitimate criterias, on legitimate concerns, impact, and especially urban educational communities. As I said, the numbers of English language learners, the need for more support services, special education population, free and reduced lunch. These are all important components that are not any different whether we educate in Buffalo, Yonkers, or Syracuse, or New York City.
Well, this interview was supposed to be about
autism.
Autism 811, but since you are very difficult to reach, you're doing the people's work.
We're keeping busy.
You know, we keep you busy. You have a lot of work to do, so we have to take advantage of this interview to talk about other things.
Well, it's
now,
my pleasure.
Mr. Nader, you handle legislation, correct?
Correct.
That's your job. Now let's talk about a little bit about friction, objections, things that you aim to accomplish that you might not be able to accomplish.
Sure.
And why? Can you give us a...
Well, government is such where, we historically, from the basis of our Constitution, whether federal or state or local, we've always tried to have a system of checks and balances. And the whole concept of checks and balances is to make sure that totalitarianism doesn't take over the way we do our government and the way we practice our government. The Constitution established on the federal level the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And what we see happening in Washington today with the impeachment process, and you see the enormous pressures from different directions to litigate and to document and research, that also goes on the state level. That's why you have really a 3-tier system: the Assembly we spoke about, the Senate, and the governor. And for a bill to proceed, you have to go through the 3 processes. people in support of that will claim, well, that disallows absolute power and control, and usually if you allow absolute power and control, you get into majority versus minority rights, and it causes an impact. I often say, you have to legislate from a perspective of looking at the big picture. Too often, if we focus too much on, what we advocate, and all of us have preferences. Some of us may be big advocates of tenants' rights. Some of us may be big advocates of the investors and the developers and the landlords and this base. And then you look at a simple piece of legislation like landlord-tenant protection, which was a big thing in New York. And a person like myself, I look at the big picture, and from one end, I want landlord-tenant laws to be in place. I want tenant protections. But then I'm a little concerned is how far do we push the envelope where we start losing investors, where developers and property owners and the individuals that we want them to spend their money and build the projects in New York State decide, oh, it's too difficult for me, let me go to South Carolina and do my new project. And we see that happening. And now the lobbying that's taken place is enormous on an issue like that. So we sit back and we listen to both sides and we try to mediate, and we try to say, hey, what can work that protects tenants and doesn't turn off our property owners and landlords. Same thing with now big legislation coming up. A similar example is legalizing marijuana in New York State. Now we've had legalization of medical marijuana, and 90% of individuals agree, yeah, that's a good thing. Medically, if it helps, it should be processed. So what do you do with recreational marijuana? When it's going on in every state around us, and New Yorkers are saying, hey, this is similar to alcohol when there was prohibition many years ago. And now, look, alcohol is legal, there's an age limit.
Mr. Nader, since you're talking about that, I have to ask you a question.
Sure.
In regards to marijuana legalization.
Yeah.
Everywhere in the United States, there is a movement to legalize marijuana.
Correct.
Some states, marijuana is legal.
Yes.
In Yonkers, we have a movement to illegalize flavored tobacco.
Correct.
So you legalize marijuana, but you legalize, flavored tobacco.
Yes.
They both addictive. So if we are fighting addiction,
correct,
okay, and we want to keep our youth away from products that create an addiction that might have a health impact, how can you, as a legislator and others, reconcile legalizing one and illegalizing the other?
And you're right. You bring up a terrific point, because that's been my position also. My concern is the same as you're saying. I'm saying to fellow colleagues, we're looking to legalize marijuana, and we're trying to take a battle with e-flavored cigarettes. I can understand that the market or the products itself needs to be more monitored, that we should make sure that we follow a new process to assure that there isn't toxins in because there has been some harm, there's been death and so forth.
There's been harm in everything,
yeah,
in alcohol,
in
marijuana, anything.
Exactly. So from that end, I wasn't too happy with the big push on trying to abolish e-cigarettes and so forth. I think they should be monitored. I think we should research, and they've been researching to see what components are causing this harm. We've had some 30 deaths and a couple of thousand injuries or illnesses. Correct. So I'm all for research it. I'm all for trying to make sure there's an age limit like we have on alcohol, so that our high school kids, this has been the biggest fear, that e-flavored cigarettes or the devices are so attractive for the young that already from the age of 12 and 13 and 14, these kids are, getting hooked on that. And that, for many of us, it still has nicotine, and it's a form of addiction that leads to further. But the same can be stated with marijuana. Is it a gateway drug? Does it lead to cocaine and heroin and so forth? And the other side of it, if it's going on all over, why not legalize it and make sure that New York doesn't lose the income that it needs to pay for additional educational costs and others? And then you look at the criminal justice aspects, which the state assembly and state government and Senate approved, where we got rid of bail reform, and we did bail reform where now you can't be placed in jail because you can't afford it, right?
That's going to cause an uproar,
Yeah, and now there's new discovery. We're talking to ADAs and district attorneys and law enforcement that are saying, hey, you got to set realistic policy, allowing us a reasonable amount of time to do our discovery. And the cost factor is enormous. So that's another area where you pass legislation, and I always say, even if you pass legislation, it's not written in stone. So even if you pass legislation, nothing stops us from going back to the drawing table, as they say at the state assembly and Senate level, and say, hey, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe we need to tweak or redefine some areas and give more time or less time, to fix this problem. Because at the end of the day, you don't want law enforcement to put their hands up and say, hey, you're forcing us on technical grounds and our inability to really follow through on discovery to give grounds for many criminals to be back on the streets. So from that end, I always say, I've always preached good listening skills, always have an open mind as a legislator, as in any other field. In medicine, in law, in education, we always say, keep a broad perspective, look at the other person's concerns. Don't just look at your concerns. And try to be realistic and rational and practical, whether you're debating or teaching or setting policy or legislation. That's part of, I think, effectiveness in any field we choose. And government is no different, and sitting on the assembly is no different. I try to apply those skills, even though they call me a freshman up there first year. I'm starting my second session. But as I said, I co-sponsored over 500 bills, the Senate and the Assembly, more than ever before. I believe it was 932 bills this last session. So it was a big, enormous, I think, busy session. And this year we're expecting the same. There's a lot
You're
of
going to be a busy man.
But I like it. I'd rather be busy than bored, Ru.
But how do you manage? Now that we're going to come to the conclusion of this interview, we could sit here the whole day asking questions back and forth, and you could be given us a class on how things work. But unfortunately, we have to come to an end.
Of course.
How do you manage your political life, your professional life, and your business life? How do you...
You know what? Communication and documentation is crucial. I recognize, what's important for me in life. Family for me is very important. My profession, I'm an attorney, that's very important for me. And my duty as an assemblyman is very important for me. So I make sure that those three components, I have designated individuals that communicate with each other, and I set up a weekly schedule and a long-term schedule of all the important events, activities. If there's court appearances I have to make, if there's important family events I have to be at, I try to make sure that I communicate with other branches of government and find out all the events and activities that are going on in our city of Yonkers, in our county. And I make every attempt to be organized and to make sure I can attend as many events as active and as possible.
So you are a top-notch organizer. I think it's an important component if you choose to follow political life, and if you have other things, you must be a very well organized person in order to
juggle. But I love it, Ru. Even before the assembly, I've always made it my business, even as an educator for many years, to be active in the community. I've served on many boards, on hospital boards, parking authority, chaired the parking authority, parks department. So for me, community service activity for me is fun. I really enjoy it.
You know, I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand. You know, during the election time, we see a lot of people that come, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, but people that we haven't heard from them ever before.
Yeah.
You, when you ran, everybody already knew who Mr. Nader Sayegh was.
Yeah.
So you came with a name with a proven record. So we wish you continue to be the same man, the same person I met 20 some years ago. And guys, Mr. Sayegh, Nader Esquire, where are you located for the people that might need your service? Since we're here, might as well say.
Might as well.
Yes.
You know, I wear a number of hats. You know, of course, my law office is at 10 Palisade Avenue.
10 Palisade Avenue in Yonkers, guys.
423-0800. And of course, my assembly office is at 35 East Grassy Spring Road. It's the Sterling Bank building off Tuckahoe and Grassy Spring Road, centrally located, and the number there is 914-779-0800. So I would appreciate that anybody that has any issues or concerns to call us, and you know, our goal is to really direct our staff to be very community minded and to really address issues and concerns individuals will have, and to really make every attempt to follow up on the concerns of individuals that we need to serve and continue to serve.
So my experience with Mr. Nader, that he's true a reachable person. It's a lot of politicians that they give their numbers out, but they're so busy, you know, and sometimes not fault of their own. They are busy, extremely busy. But you always make an effort to reach out to people who need you, correct?
Well, that's the important thing, and you know, through your efforts, I always say individuals like yourself, Rue, that reach out and make every attempt to inform the public. It's a great service, and the more informed the public is, I think the more understanding, the more communication, and the more resolution of a lot of concerns in our community. So thank you for your
So that's it. That's all that Yonkers Voice is. We are a platform that are interested in informing the public. I try to stay away from endorsing. I don't endorse, I don't oppose, but I'm very much into informing. Let the people know, then they can make a decision.
That's the bottom line.
Until next time, we will bring you more. Thank you, Mr. Nader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ross. Very nice.